Welcome back, everybody. So we had a great first panel talking about how do we rescue truth. And one of the topics that came up during that panel was about transparency. How do we achieve transparency in the social economy and how critical that is to fixing the social media crises that we find ourselves in. So, a critical step towards any solution here in the social media crisis is this notion of transparency. But nobody's going to forget that the Cambridge Analytica scandal began with Facebook sharing data with an academic institution. Okay, so we're going to get into these topics today. We've got an amazing panel. Carole Cadwalladr from The Observer. Gary King had to cancel late last night, so I'm extremely thankful to Nate Persily from Stanford Law School, who is Gary's partner in crime in creating Social Science One, a perfect replacement for Gary today. Really appreciate you, Nate, at the last minute jumping on with us. John Markoff, Pulitzer Prize winner and affiliate fellow, Stanford, and Kate Starbird, professor at University of Washington. We've got a great panel. So let me just briefly sort of set the stage here. In 2018, I gave a interview with Martin Giles of the Tech Review, where I sort of talked about what I called this notion of the transparency paradox. Okay, and the idea of the transparency paradox is that it really sets up our dual problem of our need for platform transparency, algorithmic choice on one hand, being able to know what's going on under the hood of these social platforms on one hand, and on the other hand, our need for privacy and security of our data, right? So at the present, the platforms have and continue to collect unprecedented amounts of personal data, which has a dual value. It has a value to the individual as private data, and it has a value to society in revealing how these platforms are affecting us, how they're working under the hood. So the real question that I want to set up for this panel today is how specifically, in thinking about solutions, which is really the focus of this summit today, how can we achieve the promise of transparency, revealing how these platforms are affecting us and how they work, while also upholding the values of privacy and security? That's sort of really the goal of the heart of the conversation that I want to get to today, and really focusing on what do we do? What are the solutions that we can concretely rely on to achieve this very difficult threading of the needle between transparency on one hand and privacy and security of personal data on the other hand? It's a bit of a technical topic, but honestly, it's absolutely essential to addressing all of the rest of the topics of today, because we got to know what's going on under the hood of these platforms to have any hope of solving the crises that we all have seen unfold over the last many years. So Carole, I want to start with you. You've got a storied career as a groundbreaking journalist. Perhaps most recently and most relevant to this conversation, you were the journalist responsible for breaking the Cambridge Analytica scandal and helping Christopher Wiley in particular tell his story. In a sense, that process of breaking the Cambridge Analytica scandal was a microcosm of this transparency paradox, because the sheer difficulty of making that story public, was about the way that, it was also about the way that Cambridge Analytica got hold of the data, right? Because they got hold of that data through a channel designed to increase Facebook's transparency, right? Facebook shared data with an academic institution for academics to do research about Facebook and how it works under the hood. And that attempt at transparency shuttled unbelievable types of data to a political organization for the purpose of targeting, messaging based on personality types for political consultancy gains to their clients, right? And so it's a microcosm of this problem. So Can you reflect on the process for us of breaking the Cambridge Analytica story and how it changed your views about the necessity for transparency in this context? You've talked at length about this in numerous places, but also about the difficulty of achieving transparency when analyzing people's private data is the heart of the transparency itself, right? We want these platforms to be transparent, but in order to do that, we have to analyze private data. So can you reflect on the process of breaking the Cambridge Analytica story and how it changed your views? And then can you reflect on this sort of paradox of achieving transparency by analyzing private data?
Thanks, Sinan. You've set it very well there. But I mean, I think the thing to say really is that the only people and the only entity which has privacy in this entire scenario is the company itself, Facebook. I mean, we certainly don't have privacy because they have got this colossal amount of data on us. But in terms of getting answers from the company, of actually finding out what's going on, we have zero mechanisms. We have no tools. There is almost no way. And I think the experts here know so much more about in terms of algorithmic transparency, etc. But the one thing I can speak to is journalistic transparency. And that we are so outgunned, and our ability to get hold of information and to get answers is incredibly limited. And we see this every single day of every single week. I mean, last week I wrote to Facebook's press office asking them about this latest data breach of 533 million people. Facebook's press office didn't even acknowledge my emails now. They didn't even bother to say that they weren't commenting. They just refused even to reply to me. And that's legitimate journalistic queries around what happened to 533 million people's data. And so, I mean, I think the thing is that we now all take it for read, like the Cambridge Analytica scandal, and it's such a reference point. But the odds against that coming out were so vanishingly small. And, I think the SEC report is it certainly made gripping reading for me, because that detailed how Facebook had actually, and it says it very explicitly, lied to journalists. Through 2017, I and a couple of other people were repeatedly writing to Facebook to just try and find out what had happened with Cambridge Analytica, and it just shut down our inquiries. And there was, I don't know if you saw, there was a fascinating memo which got leaked a couple of days ago. Facebook's press office accidentally sent an internal memo to a journalist. And it just says, it just has it sort of, well, this is causing a bit of fuss, this latest data breach, but we're really seeing the press interest going down very rapidly. So, we've done a blog post and, we think that should contain it, type of thing. So, and it does, that works, and we're now actually, there's sort of diminishing returns because there's so many, there's so many Facebook stories in that way. So it's even harder to break through. So that's what I just really worry about, is the fact that, you can't, how on earth are we going to hold this company to account when we can't even, get really basic questions answered? And so yes, there is, I think we have very, very little in the way of transparency, and it is a huge problem.
So let me follow up on that. So what do you think, from the perspective of a journalist trying to get answers, trying to get an understanding, trying to get data, what do you think are the points of highest leverage? Is it Freedom of Information Act submissions? Is it public pressure? Do we need more rules and regulations? Like, where are the points of leverage?
So it's, it's in the absence of legislation that works in that way. The only thing, and that's what Facebook's saying, their policies depend upon press outrage. That is how they are making their policy decisions around what they are doing with our data. And, I'm fascinated to watch the upcoming talk with Nick Clegg about this, because, this this is you know, there are so many things to worry about that, and you know, because there is, you know, we know that across the world there are these harms in, you know, countries across the world that are sort of like having fallout from you know, Facebook's tools and algorithms, and they have no chance. You know, as I'm a journalist in London, and I can't get, you know, with the shared language and culture and, you know, news organisation, and I can't get my questions answered. You know, I've spoken to journalists from Bangladesh and from India and from Sri Lanka, and you know, the level of difficulty that they face is you know, is significantly more. And so, yes, so sorry. I mean, and that's, to be honest with you, in terms of the, you know, the thing that I always recognise in terms of the Cambridge Analytica story, the reason why it became a scandal essentially is because we had this sort of transatlantic cooperation, and I think it was the fact that the New York Times joined us that that was when it became unignorable. But and, you know, a foreign newspaper in a foreign land is just very, very ignorable, and none of this would have ever come out, I don't think.
So it's, I mean, it sounds like you're saying that public pressure is essential, both journalistic.
Public pressure is absolutely essential. Public pressure is that's literally what Facebook says. Is that they are doing social media monitoring to see what the response is, to see whether they actually, if they actually will provide information or make statements or do anything. That is, and that's an extraordinarily dystopian situation, I think, to be in.
But isn't it also a little bit empowering in the sense that we've got a lot of people watching now? Can't we encourage them? Hey, keep the pressure on. The delete Facebook movement, the stop hate for profit movement, these things are moving the needle ever so slightly, and we could turn that up. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think so. Well, I mean, you know, I think so. Although you know, we saw with the stop hate for profit how actually, you know, you know, it was an amazing moment when you had companies like Coca-Cola sort of taking a stand, and yet it didn't have any impact.
Well,
I mean, and that's the, you know, you really, you know, I think, you know, the whole reason for everything I'm sort of doing now has come out of the fact that the FTC fined Facebook $5 billion, record amounts, as a result of the Cambridge Analytica scandal, and it made no difference. The share price went up. So, you know, what do you do?
Yeah,
I mean that certainly isn't enough.
I think it's absolutely essential to note that the financial impact of a month-long stop hate for profit movement or a $5 billion fine is a drop in the bucket of a growing stock price for sure. But at the same time, Nick Clegg says publicly, look, you know, our advertisers say they don't want X, Y, and Z. They don't want this type of content. They don't want that type of policy. And we have to listen to that. Do you think that's true, or do you think no?
I mean, you know, I think, like, show us the money, you know, but, you know, like, you know, every day, you know, you know, you've got academics here, you know, who've been pointing out these things and shouting about it, and it still goes on. I mean, so, you know, I think hollow words really, you know, really don't mean anything in the context when, you know, the harms are so obvious and apparent, and, you know, every day brings a fresh sort of, you know, tsunami of, you know, sort of global outrages on our shore, doesn't it?
So one final question for you before I move to Nate, which is, we've got this Facebook oversight board, okay? Which, by the way, let's be fair to them for a second, which is to say, I've never seen a private company set up a board where they say we have to abide by their specific content moderation decisions, and this is extra, you know, structural from beyond the side of the company. But at the same time, you know, you've pointed out, and you and others have created the real Facebook oversight board, which is to say, hey, we really want to be really, really independent. So on one hand, I've never seen a company make themselves beholden on content moderation decisions to a board that's not based on its employees. On the other hand, you're saying, hey, it's not independent enough. So what do you think about that?
I just, you know, the point is that if you've got a platform like Facebook, you know, it's their job. It is literally their job. And, you know, outsourcing this, your most difficult decisions to a body of experts who are, you know, making, I mean, what did we hear? Was it something like 60,000 cases they've had directed at them? I think they've picked 12 or so far. I mean, it's ridiculous. And, you know, you go back to public pressure. I did a panel a couple of days ago with a journalist from Brazil. You know, Bolsonaro is right now spreading mis and disinformation about COVID-19 on Facebook's platform. But there's no public outrage in America about that. And so, you know, what's Facebook done? It's done nothing. And that comes back to the only sort of mechanisms I see in terms of accountability is via the US press and you know, hopefully Congress. But, you know, its users in the rest of the world are, you know, have no means at the moment. And yeah, I mean, and you know, it's just incredibly problematic, I think, the Oversight Board, like billing it as a Supreme Court. You know, Facebook might like to be a country, but it's not actually a country. It doesn't have a constitution. And it just needs to take responsibility for the product that it has created.
So Nate, I want to switch to you. So you and Gary King, so with you, Nate, I want to dive right into some of the very specific solution concepts we have seen emerge in terms of really opening up these platforms for for scientific study, but then so that scientists can explain to the world what's going on under the hood of these platforms, and also to study the effects that they're having on society. So you and Gary King at Harvard spearheaded the Social Science One initiative, which is this innovative industry academic partnership designed to achieve data transparency between the social platforms and society by making data available to scientists in a safe way, so that we can answer questions about, you know, how social media platforms work under the hood, how they're influencing society, and so on. Now, Social Science One went through a lot of ups and downs. For 2 years, Facebook stalled on releasing data. The funders of Social Science One, because no data was being released, threatened to pull out. And I believe, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that they did pull out, or some of them pulled out. But then Facebook did release a very large tranche of data and used differential privacy to try to thread the needle of the transparency paradox, you know, ensuring privacy while becoming more transparent. So can you describe to us what Social Science One is, and what your experience has been in getting data and achieving meaningful platform transparency through this mechanism?
Let me answer that indirectly first, and just amplify something that Carole said, which is that my experience with Social Science One has convinced me that the only way through here is through legislation that forces the large social media and internet platforms to share data in a safe, privacy protected way with researchers. That nothing else is actually going to solve what you described as sort of the privacy transparency trade-off, because no matter what, as much public value as we as researchers say there is in the data, folks inside the company naturally are staring down $5 billion fines for privacy abuses and the like. And so unless there's some other legal equity that forces them to share the data, that there's no way that we're going to get through that. For those who are interested, I'm writing a piece of legislation on this. I've summarized at the top of my Twitter feed at Persily. Now to your question. So how did I arrive at that decision, or that conclusion? And the answer is that we started up Social Science One with the goal of finding what was an authentically independent pathway for researchers to gain access, so that Facebook would have no say over which researchers had access to the data and the like. But as you sort of hinted, it's not as if Facebook can just dump all of its data onto the research community. You need to figure out which data and under what circumstances and the like. And so within months of the creation of Social Science One, there were privacy concerns that were raised by the Electronic Privacy Information Center, writing letters against Social Science One in European Commission and the FTC, saying basically that any sharing of data with researchers was potentially a privacy violation. In those succeeding 2 years, then we moved from what I thought was going to be a kind of safe research environment in which you would have regulated, sort of observed individuals getting access to Facebook data, to one, as you said, where the data itself was then massaged and differential privacy was added, and the data that was released was at the URL level, meaning that they released millions of URLs with certain data that is associated with them, so that people could do some kinds of research on the most popular URLs, or what types of URLs were gaining traction, who was seeing them, and the like. But this is a very large data set, it's a very complicated data set, and because of the way that it's released, it doesn't answer some of the most pressing questions that we really need to answer. In the last year, Facebook has worked with researchers to study the impact of Facebook on the 2020 election, and those researchers will come up with some conclusions over, I think, the summer. But the goal of Social Science 1, as you said, was to try to make the data available to the larger research community. And I think that that has proven to be extremely hard because of this privacy transparency trade-off that you were describing.
So, let's define a few terms here, and I want to get into a little bit of the nuance about the types of research that can be done.
Yeah.
So just for a general audience, let's just say that differential privacy is a way to add noise to individual level data in order to try and preserve their privacy while being able to study individual level data with some noise, preserving privacy. You're right. It necessarily makes some research questions harder to answer. Another thing I want to point out is that if you want to study, for example, like I do, the effect of social media platforms on democracy, on elections in particular, you need some sort of causal inference. You need to know what the causal effect of social media is on behaviors, decisions, voting, opinions, and so on. So running experiments like the way these platforms do every day, thousands of experiments to figure out how to better improve their profits, running those types of experiments to see how does it affect elections, how does it affect bias, how does it affect cyberbullying, how does it affect misinformation, and so on is important. So my question is, what can we do to get better at making these platforms more secure and more transparent at the same time through differential privacy? How can we get access to being able to run experiments inside these platforms to know how they cause the effects that we are seeing in society so that we can come up with solutions? Are there approaches to this? I know you've written a white paper called Opening a Window into Tech, the Challenge and Opportunity for Data Transparency. So maybe you could tackle that question for us.
So there's two sets of questions there. One, which is about just data access, and then the other on experiments. Let me just say that if we had an open platform where academics were going in and running experiments during elections, I can tell you Carole Cadwalladr is going to be writing a lot of articles about that, and so, if you're worried about Cambridge Analytica, imagine if you open that Pandora's box. But nevertheless, I agree with you that that's kind of what we really need in terms of understanding the impact of Facebook and the like. Yeah, what was your first question?
Question is, how do we do it? How do we make
it?
Yeah.
I mean, there are three elements to any regulatory regime in order to deal with this. The first is you have to grant immunity to the platforms when they do share data under prescribed circumstances, right? It's not like you just give them immunity for something like Cambridge Analytica, but the point is if we spell out what a researcher safe harbor looks like, and under certain conditions, monitored conditions, kind of like what we would do with sensitive either defense data or IRS data or biomedical data or census data, then they will not incur liability merely from the giving of access to researchers. Second, For researchers that scrape these platforms, the public data, they also need immunity. And so there's a lot of stuff that we can do on the outside. And you know, whether it's Aaron Swartz or others, there's real fear of civil and criminal liability. There needs to be legislation to immunize them. And then we need to force Facebook and Google, and we haven't talked about Google at all here, but you know, the amount of, you know, the lack of research on YouTube is like a critical void in the research community. We need to compel them to share their data under prescribed circumstances. Now, the shadow of Cambridge Analytica is cast over all of this, and we need to recognize that. And so you need to, but there are ways of avoiding that. And there are ways of having criminal liability for researchers if they misuse the data. But we can have safe, privacy protected ways that researchers under penalty of, under criminal penalty could have access to some of this data and then find out some of the answers to these questions.
Thank you. That's awesome. I mean, platform immunity, researcher immunity, broadly speaking, completely agree with you with the black box of YouTube and research dearth on YouTube, which is such an important channel. And this notion that we have to have real legislation with teeth to compel social media platforms to share data, that otherwise the incentive structures just don't match up with them actually doing it enough to achieve meaningful transparency. Yeah.
Let me just say one other thing, which is that Europe will lead the way here. So there will be action in the next, and this is one of the things, as you know, through Social Science One, that I think we've helped open up, which is that Brussels, I think, will be the first mover here, as they are in so many things when it comes to tech regulation. And so there's a working group. Rebecca Tromble at GW is part of this, that's working on that. And I think you'll see something. Let me just say about Social Science One generally, that I've often described Social Science One as like roadkill on the highway to something beautiful, right? Which is that we needed to do some of the things that we did in order to figure out some of these problems, to have the privacy communities say what they did. If you look at the website, you will see the research data agreement, which spent about 8 months trying to negotiate with Facebook, with universities. You need these kinds of legal moves in order to have some kind of infrastructure for data access.
Awesome, thanks. John, I wanna switch to you. So you've been a leading technology journalist for a long time, author for many years. Many look to you to help us understand the role of journalism specifically in achieving transparency in technology industries. And as we know, there are both good and bad stories in these industries, not limited to data. So what are journalists' roles in this process? What are the platform's responsibilities to journalists, piggybacking on what Carole opened up earlier when it comes to transparency?
Well, I think the most interesting thing about this period is how dramatically journalism has changed in the face of this social media. And so we're entering a period, I mean, actually, you know, I thought we would go through a period where these new models of journalism would emerge. We'd shift from print journalism to interactive journalism, and we'd be in this new world. And what I realized, I think even a decade ago, is this going to be this period of, in terms of the nature of journalism, it's just period of permanent chaos. And we're still there. You know, I thought as print journalists were cast aside, there would be new jobs for interactive journalists, online journalists. And the numbers still, I think, don't, you know, just, there's not the economic basis for a sustained journalistic community to do the kinds of things that Carole talked about. It's still going in the wrong direction. And I worry particularly that we're at this inflection point. Until now, we've largely been in a world where human actors have interacted on these platforms. And the inflection point is we're at a point where increasingly most of our interactions, and this, I'm adding journalism into this, and media and news media, most of the interactions that humans are having are actually with machines and with bots and with AIs. And I think this is a particularly interesting point in time because yesterday the European Union issued a set of proposed regulations that are intended to limit the function and regulate the function of artificial intelligences. And I think it's going to be a long process. It's not clear. I mean, I've read the news reports. I haven't actually read the proposed regulations, but I think that that is in some ways a more important thing now than GDPR has been in the past, and in particularly the way the technology is going and the way these platforms are evolving.
Yeah, I mean, as I said in the opening of this summit, we're really at a crossroads today. So many governments are looking at what to do. Here in the U.S. last week, the FTC just said that they're going to step in terms of algorithmic bias. We're seeing lots of different types of motion. On journalists, do journalists have to become data scientists now? Is that sort of a part of the job now?
Well, absolutely. However, Carole's point that Facebook has not even deigned to respond anymore suggests to me that old school journalism is actually even more important now than it was before. There's been this tremendous emergence of data journalism. It's a great thing, but when they don't open the front door, you have to go in the back door. And building up sources, talking to employees who may not be on board with the management of the corporations is increasingly important. I was probably one of the first journalists to use electronic mail as a way of getting to sources. We're talking now the 1980s. This is deep, dark history. And it was wonderful because you'd have the PR people as gatekeepers and you could go around them and directly contact journalists. But there was a certain point when it became, it was a competitive advantage for a while. And then toward the end of my career, I went back to using the telephone because it was old school and often it was more effective to talk to people, not face to face, but voice to voice. And so I think that traditional journalism, the value of traditional journalism is even more important today than it was perhaps a decade ago.
So Carole and Nate, had a minute to talk about, what they think we need to concretely do as a solution to open up this transparency. Nate stating that we absolutely need legislation that compels the platforms to share data. What do you think we can concretely do to improve the relationship between these platforms and journalists in a way that addresses the transparency paradox of people keeping people's private data private and achieving transparency?
Well, so for me, I agree with both of them. The only real solutions are legislative. The notions that corporations can self-police, we've given them 2 decades. Here we are. I mean, I covered computer security going all the way back, and what was striking to me for the last decade that I did this is every year RSA Data Security, the industry conference on security, would get bigger. It became massive, and yet each year computer security became worse. And I think in the same way we're faced with the same situation of things you're talking about. So
Kate, I want to bring you into this. So you're a leading researcher on social platforms, especially when it comes to studying misinformation, studying information diffusion during crisis events like natural disasters, but also social and political crises. So as a scientist, if you could wave a magic wand and get the access you truly need to best inform the public about how social platforms are impacting society, affecting us, what types of data would you need access to most that you can't currently get?
Okay, let me speak from my perspective as a scientist. I use mixed methods more than experimental methods, and so I'll probably speak a little bit more to that. But I understand that there's other folks that use other approaches. And I think for this question, I mean, you've brought it up. The privacy paradox actually shapes a lot of that. So I'm going to pretend that's not there for now, and we can come back to what to do when we understand it's there. So we've done a lot of picking on Twitter as academics. If you look through the papers of the conferences that I've gone to for the last 10 or so years, you'll see tons and tons of studies on Twitter because that data has been public. You'll see far less on Facebook, YouTube, and some of these other platforms. And so if I think about what we really need from those platforms to understand the kind of phenomena we've been able to reveal on Twitter, but we haven't been able to kind of unpack on these other platforms. So starting with Facebook, they put out the CrowdTangle tool now. Many of us have access to that, so we can see public groups and public pages, but that's clearly not enough. We need more insight into private groups. We need insight and more visibility into how information jumps from groups to private feeds and moves through shares and reshares to kind of understand how that sort of organic sharing process takes content to the masses. We need a better understanding of what individuals see on the platforms and how they come to see that via sort of recommendations, algorithmic feeds, network connections, and those kinds of things. So there's just a ton of Facebook that's just not visible to us as researchers. I love the fact that Nate brought up YouTube. I think that YouTube is horribly understudied, in part because it's so hard to get access to the data. And so half the research study is to try to devise the methods to get the data that you need. So we need better APIs and generally just better access to YouTube. Currently, when we report on YouTube, it's because we've found evidence of YouTube videos being really prominent and influential on other platforms. But it would be good to be able to search YouTube directly without running into rate limits straight away, and to have better transparency of their recommendations and algorithms. And beyond that, we have tons and tons of other platforms, up and coming things like TikTok and others, and peer-to-peer sharing like Telegram, where we know a lot of misinformation is spreading, and we have really very little visibility into what's happening there. So in general, more visibility into what users see and where they see it and why they see it, more transparency into the policies and how they're enforced. And I do think repositories, one thing that we encountered when we started the 2020 election was a lot of the content that we realized at a certain point was really valuable had disappeared because it had been moderated and taken down. And so on Twitter, we're catching content in real time, so we can go back and see that. On Facebook, once it's been taken down or suspended, we can no longer see the record of that. So having the companies keep repositories of what content's been taken down for suspensions or other reasons, I think would be really valuable in understanding sort of the malicious use of those platforms.
So I'm going to put some of these questions directly to Nick Clegg in the fireside chat at lunch, specifically about algorithmic transparency. So stay tuned for that. But I wanted to ask you another question, because you just said we need access to your private groups. And when the audience hears that, I'm sure many of them legitimately cringe and say, wait a minute, you want to study what I'm saying in my private groups? So how do we think about balancing society's right to know with individuals' right to privacy? Do we have tools that allow us to thread this needle well?
I think that's where it becomes more important to see sort of the patterns of things moving and where we can add layers of privacy to kind of hide the identity of individuals that were participating in those groups, and even potentially the names of the individual groups, unless they're revealed in other ways. I imagine once you know things are flowing, you can unwind which groups they came from through other trace data that we would have. But I think it's more important to see the larger scale patterns in how those groups are influential in sort of mass manipulation or spreading malicious content into other parts of the ecosystem. And that's the thing, is that we have this ecosystem that's so connected within platform, across platform. And if we've got one little section that's invisible, that's doing a lot of the manipulation, it's sometimes hard to unwind it. So just to be able to isolate and say, okay, this is the effect of what those private groups are having, without necessarily knowing who within them and which individual groups. But certainly, yeah, I think there's a lot of work to be done on the layers of privacy side. And this from a researcher who participated in Social Science 1 and knows exactly how hard it was to answer some of our questions once those layers of privacy have been added.
Carole, it seemed like you wanted to get in on that.
So yes, well, it's, you know, I just got very excited about the fact that you've got Nick Clegg up next, and I was, there was a couple of things basically, which was bouncing off what Kate said about, but Mark Zuckerberg refused to come to Britain to give evidence to our parliaments, and now this is Nick Clegg. He's our deputy prime minister. He served in that parliament for many, many years. How is that? How does he defend that? I mean, that his boss showed himself to be completely impervious to our national legislature. And then my second question for Nick Clegg is that he was a passionate pro-European. And the one thing we do know is that that referendum was won and lost on Facebook's platform. And we know that these laws were broken, so, you know, that bad actors exploited that platform. But Facebook has always just refused to hand, sorry, this is the thing about what Kate was saying, when it's gone, it's gone. And when it's gone, it's gone. Our entire election, which has changed the constitution of Great Britain forever, is lost on that platform, and Facebook has refused to hand over any of the evidence. And yeah, I just like, you know, I just wonder, you know, how, I would just like some answers on that. And I'm not allowed to ask that question because he certainly won't take any questions from me, or in fact, any of my colleagues at the Guardian and Observer. So if you could bung them over for us, Sinan, I'd be grateful. Thanks.
So I want to follow up on something you just said, which is you said that the Brexit referendum was won and lost on Facebook. And
Yeah.
as somebody that researches this specifically, and having looked at all the evidence that we have available to us, I don't think we have the transparency currently to know whether that's true or not. So in a sense, I'm sort of
Well, we can. Well,
a question behind the question, right?
Yeah. So, well, then I guess the point is that because in Britain we've actually got these sort of tight spending laws, so we know how much money can be spent in the election. It's not a huge amount of money, and it was the vast majority of it was spent on Facebook, and extra illegal money was funneled onto Facebook, which Facebook, you know, that its machinery enabled those bad actors to break the law. So yes, you're right. We can't. The whole point is that we can't look at that in any detail because we don't have the evidence. But all of the surrounding evidence, which is, as I say, we know it was fought on there. But yeah, who was targeted, how they were targeted, what they were targeted with, what they were seeing, the lies that they were told, that we don't have access to.
We don't know. Yeah, Kate, it looked like you wanted to jump in on that.
I mean, I'm just thinking of other examples where, you know, not even in the election context, but we have, you know, we have evidence in our lives that people are going down the rabbit hole left and right, and very little. And we know the stories, and okay, and people would come up after me back when we had an in-person world after my talks, and they would say, oh, my loved one, you know, and this was their story, and YouTube and all these things. And so we have all, you know, we have this very anecdotal evidence, but it's really hard to put it together and make those quantitative claims because we just don't have enough access to the quantitative data to measure the impact that we have very strong hypotheses that the impact is there and very difficult to measure it.
Could I actually jump in on that also, which is so just to put a pin in it, right? There are elements of conventional wisdom that everyone takes as granted that we don't know the answer to. First is, does YouTube's recommendation algorithm actually send people toward more extreme, extremist groups and sites? Secondly, the prevalence of hate speech and disinformation, where everybody thinks that it's running, rampant on Facebook and YouTube and like. We have the only people who really know that are inside the companies. And the third is something that Carole was just mentioning, which is the effectiveness of political advertising or advertising generally, and how it affects people's opinions. The people inside, there are people inside Facebook who know the answers to these questions. And we can get glimpses on the outside, and for the most part, social scientists are telling complicated stories about those things. But we could have a Manhattan Project that answers those questions, and we can devise a research design that would figure this out. But we need to do it soon, right? Because part of it, what worries me is that policymakers are making policy in the dark, right? So that if you do not have informed research that can educate people who are about to, have regulation, say, of content on Facebook and other platforms, then you don't know whether you're going to solve the problem or make it worse.
I mean, Nate, count me in, please. For years, I have been trying to, as loudly as I possibly can, bullhorn this message out into the public sphere. We really don't know. I will say, we know a little bit, right? I mean, if you look at sort of like Brockman and Kalla and others, the research that's been done, it seems like political advertising doesn't have much of an effect on political opinions, like which way you're going to vote, but that it's the opposite for get out the vote. In other words, that it does have an effect on who votes. And by the way, we all know Facebook did an experiment, 61 million people, 2010 midterm election in the US, directly moved 300,000 votes, which is more than what was the difference in the 2016 election, indirectly moved 800,000 people to vote. Those are big numbers, right? So it seems like in terms of getting out the vote and getting people voting, it does seem to have a causal positive effect with one single tweak to the algorithm. But in terms of actually changing the way people vote, it looks over and over again like there's zero effect on that. I mean, what do you think about that?
Well, I mean, there's a lot to say about all of those things. And part of the question, one of the big questions is how different is the online environment from the legacy media environment, right? So that there's been a huge debate for years about the impact of political advertising on television and whether it makes a difference. Now, look, in a low information race where the only information you get is from advertising of whatever form, of course, it's going to have a bigger difference than it would be in, a presidential race where you're going to get, all kinds of information from so many sources. Look, I cut my teeth on the voter turnout literature a long time ago in graduate school. We've probably studied that more than almost any other issue. But the question, right, apropos of what Carole was saying, what we worry about most, right, is massive amounts of spending from the candidates, campaigns, and interest groups, and how that might either shift the composition of the electorate through voter turnout or alienation, right? Or how it converts people in their political preferences. And we only, sort of have the nuggets of information about how that might have happened in 2016 and 2020. 2016, right? The narrative is that $100,000 of Russian political ads on Facebook that mostly dealt with issues somehow had this massive effect on the ecosystem, right? I think we all agree that whatever effect something like that is happening in paid communication, the organic content, which is really much more overwhelming, is going to have a bigger impact, right? Because you're just getting so much more of it. And I do think that, Facebook, if it eliminated political ads tomorrow, it probably would not have much of an effect on something like a presidential election where the money will just flow into other vectors. But again, it's not just presidential elections where these things matter, whether it's referenda or whether it's local and congressional elections, it could make a difference.
So I want to bring our audience in. John, go ahead.
Well, I worry about fighting the last war a lot in this context. Yeah. I wanted to ask the data scientists where we are on fake accounts. The last thing I've seen is Sophie Zong's memo at the end of last year, which suggested to me that fake accounts are still a huge problem. And I worry about in the context of other than human beings being behind those accounts in the future.
Kate?
Yeah, so my understanding, and this is a moving target based on, papers that are, coming through, being published and reviewed, are that the fake accounts are still present. They're still present in high numbers, but my understanding is that they don't actually have a lot of effect on individuals that follow them or see their content. Their main purpose is to manipulate the algorithms, to try to grow the followers of another account, or to, bump something up in the recommendations by suddenly liking a bunch of things. And so it gets bumped in the recommendations. So that mostly we're seeing fake accounts used to manipulate algorithms and not directly influence individuals. So you're more likely to see the content they're amplifying than you are to see the content that they're sharing directly. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. What I worry about is what happens when the progress that's been made in language models is significant. And what happens when you put language models that are intended to interact with human beings behind these things? That's the next war as far as I can see.
Yeah, I'm worried about that as well, having studied just copied and pasted content, not even in social media, but across websites, and how effective that was at getting people this false sense of triangulation. And that was when it was almost exactly the same content. And so now we'll have the ability to sort of astroturf slightly different content, which is really going to both disrupt our our psychological mechanisms of dealing with this content, we won't be able to see that it's not the same person. We'll think it's different voices, and certainly it'll make it harder for the detection of those things unless somehow the arms race of detection with these models can keep up with the models themselves.
So I want to bring our audience in and take some questions for the audience. So broadly, anybody can jump in. What does the panel think about legislation to mandate the public release of all advertising data, including the targeting parameters as proposed in Europe and in a more limited form in the US in the Honest Ads Act?
So I can jump in here if you want. So I'm in favor of it, except there are some privacy implications in doing that. And so this actually goes back to your discussion of differential privacy, which I kind of glossed over. But part of the problem here is if you know what the targeting criteria are in an ad and you know who received the ad, you can start knowing something about the people who received the ad, right? So if you know that you're targeting people who are cancer survivors or something like this, and then you find out somebody who had the ad, then you know something about that person, right? And so there are ways to deal with that problem, right? And it's one of the many data issues that you can solve. And Google and Facebook have taken different approaches in their ad libraries as to how they deal with targeting versus exposure. But clearly we need to have better data on both of those factors.
Oh, don't get me started on targeting and exposure data. Another question from the audience. How do we ensure the transparency of the social platform's own experiments on users? The emotional contagion experiment as a specific example, we're talking about researchers doing experiments in safe harbor and regulated ways. What about all those other experiments? How do we ensure transparency there? And who wants to jump in there?
I could go again, but does someone else want to?
I'll just go quickly and sort of strengthen that question a little bit, or even just affirm it. Every time I hear the research community arguing about the need to do more experiments, I think back to running these debates in my classroom for the last 10 years or whatever, since the emotional contagion experiment, about how just the ethical fraughtness of that and how people perceive it, and certainly how, the issues of consent and whether or not people are consenting to these things. And I know Facebook tried to do something different with that this year, where people actually consented to be part of these studies. But I do think there's some need for a framework around how those experiments should work, whether academics are doing them or the companies are doing them themselves.
So a question for Carole and John. Does it make sense to explicitly create teams of journalists and data scientists working together now?
Carole.
I think the old models of journalism don't work in so many ways. So I think just more collaboration, more across news organizations, across disciplines is kind of absolutely fundamental. And because, the thing that, we see is just that Facebook plays journalists off against each other all the time. It plays off one outlet against another. It plays favorites. And so, I really feel that we have to adapt to that, and that there is, we need to create new models where there is there's solidarity and strength, essentially, in terms of demanding answers and all the rest of it. And I think the idea of cross-disciplinary approaches is another part of that, and would be brilliant to see. I mean, some of it does already happen, but just generally with everything to do with journalism, we need more of it. We need more resource, we need more journalists, we need more money, we need the platforms to stop destroying our business models.
John?
Just to say that large journalistic organizations like New York Times, that's been the model for a number of years. It just is the way it works. And I'd just like to briefly jump back with respect to the last question. I mean, next week, I believe Apple's going to run this fascinating experiment of, giving people control over what they want to share for the first time. And I don't know if researchers will get access to that information, but I think it's the first time that we're going to see what consumers actually feel about the practices in the industry in sort of a real world kind of way.
So I'm going to direct a question to Kate, but I'm actually going to take the liberty of trying to answer one of these questions that's coming from the audience a little bit as well. The question is, what about when academic research is funded by the platforms? How transparent and objective is that? Wink, wink, nudge, nudge emoji, wink emoji, wink emoji, which, by the way, you know, I'm getting these questions in my chat feed. I don't have to ask them. And that's why I'm asking it, because it's a critical question for academics that they need to answer. Totally agree. Totally agree 100%. I prefer to collaborate with platforms where we get data access, but the funding is not from the platform itself. And I have very strict personal standards for how I deal with navigating the setup and execution and reporting of a certain study. Certainly set up all of those frameworks in the conversation in advance before doing any of the research. We have data use contracts that have been well designed at MIT that ensure our ability to publish, that ensure our ability to say what the result is, regardless of what the result is. We have honed those over many years in order to maintain objectivity, in order to maintain our ability to say what the answers are, and so on. And I have had some issues. So I have had to fight actual legal battles. I've had to spend hours in meetings with lawyers around those types of exact questions. And in each of those scenarios, and thankfully, I just want to give a big shout out to MIT, stuck to our guns, and MIT as an institution brought the full weight of their influence into the conversation to stand up for the science and for the objectivity of the scientists trying to publish the results of studies. Kate, I wonder what your experience has been.
We spend hours, and we have a new center at the University of Washington, hours and hours talking about this challenge, both on the funding side and the data access side, because both are ways that a platform can exert control over researchers, as well as just the perception of compromise, which I think is almost just as important when you're studying disinformation. And so we've been very, very reluctant to take any money from any of the platforms that we're studying. And at the same time, we're in a world where, you know, maybe not this year, but other years, the government funding of science is shrinking. The platforms have more and more money because, and in many ways, we're serving a service to them because we're helping them figure out what's going on in their platforms. And at the same time, we really can't take money from them. So that was one of the things I thought was really important about Social Science 1, is it gave distance between the funding and the data access, between the platforms and the researchers on both of those dimensions. And I think it's really important that researchers don't have to rely on personal relationships with people at the platforms for either asking for funding or for asking for data.
And that's right. You know, we tried, you know, we had this coalition of about 10 funders on the outside. And thank you for saying that, Kate. But Sinan, you sort of talked about the difficulties, you know, with the funders too, right? Which is that, you know, they get frustrated with Facebook. They get, you know, you have to be in there for the long haul. It's very difficult. We at the Stanford Cyber Policy Center don't take money from the big platforms, and I stayed away from anything with getting money from Facebook or Google and the like. And you know, especially at Stanford, we got to, you know, we're in the belly of the beast here, so we got to be really careful about that. But I wonder whether there is a way through where we could have a fund that they contribute to, that they then have no connection, that they will have no control over the research, right? So if each one of the big platforms gave $10 to $20 million or more and put it into a separate fund that they then have no control over, would there be, you know, and then it's administered by the National Academy of Science, you know, you figure out some way of having real independence for social media research, that might fill some of the gaps that Kate's talking about with government funding and the like. You know, people will still pursue, you know, you got to figure out a way to have general authentic independence, but it's really, really difficult.
Nate, a big kudos to you for the proposal you just proposed about a fund that they contribute to. One gripe, I think the numbers are a little low there. I think $50 to $100 million.
Well, as long as we're doing that, let's say $500 million. I mean, look, they find it in the couch cushions at these platforms anyway. So it's like, as long as we're talking, what's a few $100 million between friends here? But yeah, sure, that's fine.
I mean, I really, in all seriousness and tongue in cheek and so on, it is small numbers for them, but we need this money in order to be able to do the research that's going to help us fix the social media crises that we find ourselves in. That's going to help us make all of this more transparent. So I want to bring this to a close. We've come to 11:45 on the East Coast. I just want to thank all of you for taking the time to participate in this incredibly important conversation. Carole, in a completely different time zone, it's getting late over there for you. Thank you for sticking around. Kate and Nate on the West Coast, getting up early to have this conversation with us. We really, really appreciate all of you, and also to the audience for submitting such great questions. We're going to roll into a break here. And then we're going to come back for the fireside conversation between me and Nick Clegg at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. We will see you soon. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen.